Bueno, buenos días a todas y a todos. Bienvenidas y bienvenidos a la segunda sesión del seminario organizado por el grupo de investigación STEM, South Training Action Network of the Coloniality de la Universidad de Granada, en colaboración con la Escuela Internacional de Posgrado de la Universidad de Granada, el Instituto Confucio de la Universidad de Granada y el programa de doctorado en Historia y Arte en el marco de las actividades del Máster en Estudio de Asia Oriental. Nos alegramos mucho de volver a veros. Y vamos a dar comienzo a esta segunda sesión, que va a ser una sesión más centrada en China y en temas de identidades en China y de conflictos identitarios en China, precisamente. Para ello, contamos con la presencia y la compañía del profesor Enze de la Universidad de Hong Kong y del profesor Rémi Castets de la Universidad de Bordeaux. Y voy a dar paso a la presentación del profesor Enze. Es profesor asociado en el Departamento de Política y Administración Pública de la Universidad de Hong Kong. En 2010 obtuvo su doctorado en la Universidad de George Washington y después estuvo de estancia postdoctoral en Princeton y estuvo trabajando en el SOAS de Londres en el Departamento de Seguridad Internacional de Asia Oriental. Su investigación se centra especialmente en temas de política étnica en China, de relaciones entre China y el sureste asiático y de la política de construcción estatal en la frontera del sureste asiático. Sin alargarme más, le cedo la palabra al profesor. Muchísimas gracias por estar aquí.
Thank you.
Whenever you want.
Should I speak to this or this?
Yeah, both.
Okay, all right. And PowerPoint that. All right, thank you everyone. Thank you for Kiara for inviting me to come to Granada, which is really a good opportunity to be here and talk to you about politics of ethnic identity in China. And then I think today's talk, I will mostly be more broad in the coverage of how we understand the politics of identity in China, and particularly I want to introduce you different ways to understand the politics of ethnicity in the Chinese context, and the different patterns of contestation, of politicization we can think of in the Chinese context. So my talk is mostly going to be broad in the coverage, and I will also cover some historical trajectories of how the Chinese national identity has been constructed, and also its contemporary trends. And then I think afterwards, Professor Rémi will talk more specifically on the Uyghur in Xinjiang, etc. So, all right. So, politics of identity in China. So, when we think about the Chinese context, obviously this is a very large country in terms of its population, as well as in terms of territorial span. Essentially, its continental state covers from East Asia all the way to Inner Asia, Central Asia. And so likewise, in the sense that it also has tremendous amount of internal diversity, not simply in terms of ethnicity, but also in terms of language, religion, etc. So this is the map you're seeing right now is basically a linguistic map of China in terms of different languages spoken in China, but also different dialects that perhaps belong to parts of the Semitic languages that are also spoken in different parts of the country. But the question today I will mostly focus on is how do we understand different patterns of ethnic identity contestation in the Chinese context. So obviously we are very familiar with the cases of Tibet or with Xinjiang, right? And basically the Uyghurs and Tibetans often are featured in the news in terms of how they carry out resistance against the Chinese state, how, for example, Chinese repression against religious expressions in Tibetan context, or how basically the Chinese state use discourse of war terror, in terms of try to silence or suppress any type of resistance against of its political rule in Xinjiang. So this is obviously has been popularly received and widely circulated in the media. However, on the other hand, we do need to notice that this is only two of the major groups in China who have been protesting or resisting against the Chinese rule. And this not necessarily represent the same story for all the other ethnic groups in the country. In fact, there are more diversity, more variations in terms of patterns of political relations between different ethnic groups and the Chinese state. So this is basically the question that I'm going to address today, and in terms of trying to talk you through different patterns of relations between different ethnic groups with the Chinese state or with the majority ethnic Han Chinese in the country, but also try to give you an explanation or my explanation of why that is the case. But obviously, this is just my own interpretation, and there are different other explanations, and often that is something, a subject we can discuss perhaps later on in a question Q&A session. And finally, I will talk about some of the contemporary trends of how to understand the current situations of ethnic relations in the country, but also try to project what is going to happen in the future. Do I talk too fast? Is that okay? Okay, all right, good. So we think about ethnic diversity in China, and officially there are 56 ethnic groups that is registered or categorized by the Chinese state. And obviously the largest group is the majority so-called Han Chinese, even though there is lots of diversity within the Han Chinese group as well, but somehow this is categorized as one singular group, and there's basically over 1.2 billion people, right? It's a very large number of people. But then again, there are also many other groups that who are categorized as minorities, and they are also a very large population size, right? So in addition to the Uyghurs and Tibetans just mentioned earlier, but there are also many other ones who are over the population of, let's say, 10 million or even similar, right? So which means that there are many other groups perhaps you've never heard about, but then they live in different parts of the country, and they might have different, let's say, linguistic or religious differences from the majority Han Chinese. But then again, they are overall speaking, let's say, politically relatively not as restless as the other two. So that is part of the explanation I will try to engage later on to explain why there is such variation. Now, the reason why I mentioned basically the minority group population in the country, according to the latest 2010 census, essentially it's less than 10%, right? So in a sense, it's not necessarily that large, right? It's not, for example, we think about some other countries might have some majority, let's say, in Burma, for example, the majority population is only about 60%. So in the Chinese context, obviously 90% are Han Chinese. In some ways, they have super majority in the country. But on the other hand, the geographic concentration or geographical distribution of population is not even, in the sense that even though the non-Han Chinese population are relatively small in terms of percentage, well, although in terms of actual number, it's quite large, right? It's more than 10 million, more than 100 million, sorry. But then again, they occupy pretty much all the, let's say, peripheral regions around the country. And then they count for almost 50 to 60% of the Chinese territory in terms of size, right? So in a sense of its strategic importance, in terms of its, let's say, potential for natural resource exploitation, etc., it has basically a tremendous amount of significance for the country, right? That's the reason why the Chinese state has put a lot of emphasis trying to secure its borderland region, and usually it's where the ethnic minority groups reside. It's in those borderland areas. So that's some kind of the differences between population percentage, but and the geographical distribution of the population. When we think of the current PRC, right? I'm talking about People's Republic of China or China in general, and in some ways it inherited a empire from its let's say, pre-modern period, right? So the different dynasties in the Chinese context, particularly the last Qing dynasty, has a very strong multi-ethnic sort of nature to its identity, in the sense that the ruling court, the Manchu, essentially is Indo-Asian people, right? So they came from the north and they conquered the whole of China and they declared themselves as the son of heaven. But then again, the story of the Manchu kings, emperors as son of heaven is only part of the story. The Manchu emperors, other than conquering, let's say, the China proper, meaning, let's say, the provincials, the provinces in China, but also expanded its rule pretty much throughout inner and Central Asia, right? So Kangxi and Qianlong Emperor, for example, marched west to Indo-Asia and conquered, pretty much defeated Zhongga Mongols and conquered Xinjiang, right? And that's basically the story of military conquest, and in the end secured a very large territory under the Qing's rule. But on the other hand, the Qing's rule is very multi-ethnic in the sense that the emperor took on itself different identities to different people. And what I mean is that, for example, the Qing emperor called itself as the son of heaven for the Han Chinese. But then it also called itself as the golden Khan for the Mongols, and it called itself as a manifestation of Manjusuri, which is basically a Bodhisattva for the Tibetans. So in some ways, this is a very, very much a multi-ethnic empire, right? It spanned large spans of territory. And then when the Qing collapsed in 1910, and basically the story is how you can deal with the nature of the multi-ethnic sort of large span of territory and, let's say, the need to consolidate into the modern sense of a nation state. And that essentially is the challenge that faced from the early years of Republican government from 1910 onwards, but also pretty much from the PRC from 1949 onwards. During the Republican period, essentially, you guys probably studied Chinese history before. It's a period of a high amount of instability, right? You have a nominal government in Nanjing and later on to Chongqing, but then again, usually they were very weak. And they were facing foreign aggression. They were also dealing with internal warfare with the communists, etc. So which means even though on the one hand they did talk about how they deal with the reality of multi-ethnic society, right? So for example, the founding father of the Republic, Sun Yat-sen, talked about the Chinese nation as comprised of 5 nationalities, etc. But then again, most of these sort of, let's say, claims or the goals, for example, try to assimilate all the ethnic groups into a common group of people. They'll basically remain on paper. They never really had any real-world implications because the state has literally no capacity to enforce or try to carry out a nationwide, let's say, a sort of education kind of campaign. So many of the simple fact of lack of capacity of the Republican government means that many of the peripheral regions during this period, let's say from 1910 when the Qing collapsed and then the founding of the PRC in 1949, essentially this was a period the peripheral regions enjoy high amount of autonomy or even independence in a sense, right? So think about Tibet. Tibet in 1913, the Tibetan government signed a treaty with the British India government. Simla Treaty essentially sort of recognized the semi-autonomous de facto independent status of the Tibetan government, right? So during this period, even though the Nanjing government never recognized the treaty, but then again, during this period, there was some kind of understanding that the Tibetan government in Lhasa at the time had some sense of self-rule. Similarly, in Xinjiang during this period, essentially this is the area where you have periods of warlords control, you have Islamic republics, you have different type of civil war going on in the region when you have Muslim warlords from China basically invaded Xinjiang. So it's essentially the borderland regions during this period, a tremendous amount of instability. Right, we cannot really think of, let's say, a concrete or coherent style of government. But that was basically during this period. And then when the communist government came into rule in 1949, and this is essentially a much stronger state in both its intention, try to consolidate its so let's say the mandate in the vast territory that it's sort of considered is entitled to, but also in terms of its capacity that has the means to basically carry out many of the projects, basically create a nation state on top of the diverse population. So that's basically the story I'm going to focus mostly today. Now, during the early years of the PRC, in some ways that the communist government were inspired or basically inspired by the Soviet model, right? And the Soviet model essentially guarantees some type of autonomy or for different republics, right? In the Soviet Union context, basically you have 15 Union republics. They all have a very strong sense of self-rule. But then again, in the Chinese context, obviously, the Chinese constitution in 1952 did not really promise, let's say, the right for secession. But then again, still on paper, it promised different types of autonomy for its peripheral regions. And in the early years, obviously, this kind of promise of cultural autonomy and let's say the visions, initial visions of multi-ethnic state were essentially at the beginning, for example, did have real consequences in terms of policy implementation. Think of many of the land reform policies in the China proper, in many of the provinces, for example, they were carried out quite ruthlessly. But land reform did not really occur in the peripheral regions until much later partly because the state was still consolidating its rule in the peripheral regions. That's why they need the support of local elites. But on the other hand, essentially at the beginning, there were some sort of like debates within the party in terms of how they should deal with the different realities, social realities of the multi-ethnic peripheral frontier region, etc. In 1956, the Chinese state carried out a very ambitious project called ethnic registration. This is a typo here, ethnic identification project. And this is basically a project that the Chinese state sent many people around the country to try to identify and categorize different groups of people as belonging to different type of ethnicity. Right, and this is the project has very, on one hand, it borrowed some of the Soviet, particularly Stalin's definition criteria for what it constitutes a nation, right? So usually whether a group has common language, they share common territory, have similar economic life, etc. But on the other hand, this project has continual consequences today, right? So if you were identified as Group A, and that will basically become, let's say, the marker on your ID card. Essentially, that is going to carry on through later decades in terms of whether it will influence your job opportunities, in terms of influence your access to the education, but also in terms of many other, let's say, potential for discrimination, etc. But then again, and that was in some ways, a very defining moment for the Chinese state to understand, on the one hand, how many people living in its country, its territory, are ethnic ethnic minority, but also who belongs to which group is also the outcome of this project. So that means that on one hand, you have this sort of nominal communist sort of multi-ethnic notions of, let's say, equality among different groups, which means that, for example, in the Constitution, it promised that different ethnic groups are equal and they have the right for self-autonomy. But then again, in reality, that was different. What manifests essentially was the consistent emphasis on the majority Han Chinese as more advanced, more superior than the minorities in terms of its progression along a very scientific scale of development. Right, so that is, in the Chinese context, often, for example, the Han Chinese feel itself has the obligation or burden to help the other minority groups who are less advanced, right? So in some ways, you can find almost a equivalent of the, let's say, the white man burden in some sense, you know, to try to have the responsibility to educate and promote, help the other ones to develop. So this kind of the mentality was very much the thing during the early years of PRC that the Han Chinese call itself the big brother for the minority groups. So the early years of these kind of relatively moderate policies did not really last very long. And then, and when we basically entered the mid-1950s and basically pretty much all the way through to the end of the 70s is essentially 2 decades of political radicalization and instability in the country, right? You have the Great Leap Forward, you have Cultural Revolution, and during those periods, essentially, you had indiscriminate violence against the population as a whole, right? So how do we understand the violence during this period? On the one hand, obviously, the violence was committed indiscriminately throughout the society. In a sense, it was not because you are Uyghur or you're Tibetan, you are repressed more. That equally amount of violence was committed to the Han Chinese population as well. Right, so that is basically, in some ways, it's basically state violence, indiscrimination throughout whole society. But what's more important is how these violence are perceived by local people, or who are committing those violence. Right, and then often the identity of the committer has consequences of how people understand the relations of power in a multi-ethnic society. Right? So imagine you are in a majority predominant Han Chinese community, then the violence committed by your neighbors to you would not necessarily take on an ethnic dimension. Right? It's basically a political dimension. Basically, it might be different class relations, might be because of party orientation, but essentially would not take on the tone of ethnic violence. But in ethnic minority regions, it did take on an ethnic dimension to them, right? And particularly, the understanding was that this violence was committed by the state, which has very strong sort of Han Chinese identity to them. So that's basically the reason why this is a period and many of the violence committed to the minorities, even though they were equally did the same throughout the whole China, but then again, it had buried some of the roots for later on sort of grievances that has very strong tint of ethnic grievance. That's because of some of the other, this kind of dynamic is very different from the other parts of China. Since then, obviously, let's say those violence and instability during the radical period has gone, and basically from the early 1980s, and you have a period try to reverse to the previous more inclusive, let's say early 50s type of policies of accommodation to the minorities. Different minority population. So that from 1984, you had a new law on regional autonomy. And this is essentially sort of, on paper as well, promised and guaranteed different levels of autonomy for different ethnic groups, and promised, let's say, different rights for education, for healthcare, and etc. and also institutionalized some form of affirmative action in the sense that you had more, let's say, less restrictions on family planning, less restrictions for more favorable, let's say, quota allocation for university entrance, etc. There are some level of preferential hiring in the public sector, but not in the private, but in the public sector. Often, local government might have certain seats reserved for, different groups, people, etc. But there is a general lack of let's say, genuine autonomy, in the sense that many of those sort of like promises or items that included in 1984 law on regional autonomy, many of them were not enforced. Basically, there's a tremendous amount of variation across the country in terms of how much, let's say, local government are willing to carry out their own interpretation of the autonomy law. And finally, in a sense that national security has taken on the priority over any sense of, let's say, political rights, right? So basically, any rights for, let's say, to demand political recognition, or basically like rights to demand for, let's say, equal treatment, or rights for like different like particular language education, like in the minority languages, for example, often are not guaranteed, and in some ways can be utilized as a way to suppress dissident in the country. Right. So often using, let's say, the excuse of national security, and those demands often would basically be interpreted as a political dissent, right? And that is basically some of the problems that continue to haunt the contemporary Chinese policies towards the minorities. So different patterns of ethnic identity politics. So I mentioned earlier on, we have various active resistance, let's say, in Tibet and Xinjiang towards Chinese rule. In some ways, that the Tibetan movement is much more international. It also has perhaps a longer history, right? So essentially from the early 1950s, when the PLA entered Tibet, there's basically started some level of international campaign on the Tibetan question. I will talk more later about specifically on the Tibet question. And then obviously currently in 2008 there was a big riot in Tibet, and since then even though as a result of, let's say, increased security measures in Tibet, but then again there are more than 100 cases of like self-immolation. People burning themselves, right? And not in Tibet itself, it's mostly in Sichuan, in Tibetan regions in Sichuan. So that's, in some ways, is the continuation of this kind of form of resistance against the Chinese rule. And on the other hand, you also have the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, which in some ways is relatively, let's say, not has as much sort of international profile in comparison with the Tibetan cause. But recently has taken on much more, let's say, militant sort of style in terms of the resistance against the Chinese state, right? So, in 2009 there was a big riot, and then in capital city, and you have almost like close to 200 people dead, and as a result. And then you have, continual report like coming out from Xinjiang about, let's say, people, let's say, people would storm the police station, and then there are lots of killings and going on, etc. But obviously, the media has been very restricted in terms of the access to the region. So many of the details are very murky, but somehow still there is a very strong sense of, let's say, militarism in the region. And then that's sort of often people utilize that as perhaps as indication of the Islamic fundamental influences in the region, etc. But then this is also up to debate in terms of how much of it is actually influenced by international Islamic radicalization, or how much of it actually was a genuine response towards the political repression by the Chinese state. So this is basically 2 cases of active resistance, let's say, put it that way, of the minorities towards the Chinese state. But then again, there are some other major groups in the country have taken on different ways of dealing with the Chinese state. So for example, there's about 1.2 million Koreans living in China. They are Chinese citizens, in Chinese they're 朝鲜族, 朝鲜族, 朝鲜族. So the patterns of relations between the Chinese Koreans and Chinese state has not really taken on, let's say, a confrontational one. Ever since the founding of the PRC, right? You can trace their legacies to the Korean War. Basically, they were on the side of China, basically fighting on behalf of North Korea, against, let's say, the South and Americans. But still, ever since the 1990s, when the PRC normalized relations with South Korea, the dominant pattern for the Chinese Koreans was not necessarily to resist the Chinese state, but rather to move out, to emigrate to South Korea. Right, so so that's one of the exit. Also, you can call it exit strategy in a way that if you don't think you like what's going on in the country, you can move out. Right, and that's what happened. What has happening among the Koreans in the Chinese case is that basically during the past 2 decades, you have very strong waves of emigration from the northeastern part of China, which is also the economically more depressed. Rust Belt kind of sense of the region. And then when you have limited amount of local economic opportunities in the region, then people choose to go to South Korea, where let's say your income is higher, and then you can, you have very similar, like let's say, linguistic and cultural, customs, and which it's much easier for them to adapt. So that's basically one of the strategies has been carried out by the Koreans, is more, let's say, exit. And there's also a very large autonomous region called Inner Mongolia. Inner Mongolia, often in many sort of, let's say, popular media, has been often grouped together with Tibet or with Xinjiang. But the reality in Inner Mongolia is actually quite different from these two, the other 2 regions, for a variety of reasons. Part of the reason was that you can trace the historical origins, let's say, of revolution in a way that both Xinjiang and Tibet did not really have, let's say, its own indigenous, let's say, mobilization by a communist party. But in Inner Mongolia, its revolution, its communist revolution, was indigenous in a sense. It was a merge between the Inner Mongolia Communist Party and the Communist Party of China, in a way. So in some ways, you have the early marriage of convenience, perhaps, of these 2. On the other hand, a demographic pattern in the region is also more to the advantage of the Han Chinese, in the sense that more than 80% of the population in the region are Han Chinese, right? So in a way that the Mongols are of a very strong, very small minority, even in their own, let's say, ancestral land. But on the other hand, the Inner Mongolia as a whole, how should I say, and lack of strong international sort of support, right, international dimension to it. Part of the reason was that there is a country called Mongolia, right, and that is Inner Mongolia, which is in China. I will not go into details of how did that happen, in a way that it all has to do with the Qing's different style of rule. But when we think of the contemporary sort of comparisons people often made between Inner Mongolia and Mongolia as a country itself, often that you find, let's say, economically speaking, Inner Mongolia actually is much more advanced, developed than Mongolia itself. At the same time, the process of national identity construction in Mongolia itself in some ways excluded the Chinese Mongolians. So part of the reason was that there are more Mongolians living in China than Mongolia itself. So that makes makes the case that the Mongolian government did not really want to include so many, let's say, people who are outside or into these constructions of what constitute a proper Mongolian. Right, so that's the reason why the national identity construction process in Mongolia itself has been emphasizing on a very sort of, let's say, tribal nature of the groups that are concentrated in Mongolia itself, rather than looking at the inner Mongolians in China. So that's the reason why the inner Mongolia autonomous movements and did not really have much sort of traction today. So since 2009, you have some episodes of, let's say, protest often relates to sort of pasture rights and whether land reclamation, settlement of nomadic societies, etc. But those protests, in comparison, if you look at what kind of demands have been made, right? So if you look at Tibet or Xinjiang, often the demand is very clear. Often is free Tibet, or you want independence. But those kind of demands or slogans were never there in Mongolia. Often the demands were much more moderate. Often the demand is not necessarily for, let's say, independence or kind of claim. Rather, most of the demands were for more inclusion or more accommodation with the Chinese state to understand or to provide a better form of governance rather than a totally different kind of ethnic or nationalistic kind of claim. Right, so that's one of the reason that there is, I can argue, there are more ambivalence, for example, today in terms of what the many of the population in Mongolia really want for the region. And then on the other hand, there are many other groups, probably smaller in size, more sparsely distributed across mountain regions in the southwest of China. And then the reality was that many of them have actively, let's say, being assimilated into the majority, in a sense that these days you can find pretty much, the compulsory education system throughout the country, and then only in areas that, for example, a formal bilingual education are provided, right? In the sense in Tibet or in Xinjiang or etc. There are some level of bilingual education has been provided, but then in many other places there's no such education provision for the minority languages. So basically, after, let's say, a few years of school, and then you basically become monolingual in Mandarin, right? Or basically take on a note of a style that, let's say, Mandarin become the high culture language, and then your local ethnic language become a kitchen language, like more of a low class, kind of a low culture language, which is often the case in many societies as well. So how do we explain these sort of broad patterns of variations? So the one common explanations you find when people look at Tibet or Xinjiang alone, usually the emphasis often is on domestic repression. And that is often is the case. It's right in a way that there is a tremendous amount of the violence and repression that has been carried out by the state and towards any form of a dissent. But then again, on the other hand, if you think about in terms of state violence is pretty much perhaps these days is much more specifically exclusively so reserved for Tibetans or Uyghurs in Xinjiang. But then again, during the, let's say, I've already talked about in the 60s and 70s, violence will pretty much indiscriminately applied throughout the whole country. So in some way, that means internal factors alone is not necessarily the only explanation. There are many other things that are sort of in the making that made, let's say, the Tibetan question or the Xinjiang question much more complicated. Now, and this is essentially how the international dimension come into force. So the I mentioned earlier on, from the early 1950s when the PLA entered Tibet, much of it, obviously there was little resistance because it was difficult to fight against a much more superior military force. But there were a tremendous amount of diplomatic maneuvering by the Tibetan missions in India. So from the early 50s onwards, at the beginning was the purpose was to try to secure some type of support first from the government of India, and then later on perhaps try to get some support from the Americans or the British. But somehow in 1950, when the troops entered the Tibet, the Indian government at that particular time, Nehru government, was more interested in terms of securing a friendly relationship with Beijing. So they were not willing to support Tibetans' claim for let's say independence or autonomy. And so that was one of the reasons basically that compelled the Tibetan government to send its delegation to Beijing to sign the 17-point agreement. Right. So 17-point agreement was the first document, in some way a treaty essentially, signed between the central government of China and a minority group, sort of guarantee its right for self-rule. Right. But obviously from mid-1950s, you had rebellions throughout the Kampa regions in Sichuan and Qinghai, and later on spread to Tibet itself. And then also, the international environment facing the communist China has changed. From 1950 onwards, essentially, especially after the Korean War, the American attention has been squarely focused on containing the PRC. So because of the Korean War and then the shift of American strategic attention to East Asia, that made, so obviously, the Taiwan case, but also an American support for the Tibetan cause from mid-1950s onwards. And so basically from mid-1950s until 1972, when Nixon visited China, that was the high period of Tibetan insurgency. And you have a very sort of active military insurgency carried out by Tibetan guerrilla fighters in the borderland region between India, Nepal, and Tibet. Right? And many of them were trained by CIA, etc. Right? So this was active insurgency at the time. But obviously, when Americans dropped it because they want to, sort of patch up relations with Beijing, and then the Tibetan cause died out pretty much during 50s until late 1980s. Then you have, let's say, the end of global communism, right? Berlin Wall collapsed, and then there is overall a global trend for human rights and democracy, and then suddenly, and again, the Tibetan cause start to have a, let's say, rebirth in a way that become a very hot topic, basically, when people who Dalai Lama won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1989. And so all the things basically coming together in a way that made it so that it's such an international sort of phenomenon. You have sort of a high amount of support for the peaceful resistance by the Tibetans, not only, for example, in Europe, right? So the European Parliament, for example, passed many resolutions, for example, demand on Tibetan question. But similarly, in many other parts of the world, that often this is Dalai Lama himself has taken on the aura of the person for human rights and democracy, etc. This international dimension was also quite significant in the Xinjiang case. But then again, before '89, that was Soviet Union who were carried out most support for the Uyghurs, and this is partly because of the split of relation between the PRC and the USSR from 1960 onwards, right? So from 60 onwards, most of the, let's say, Uyghur activism, let's say resistance against Chinese, or even propaganda against Chinese rule, were all carried out by Soviet Union in Central Asia. All the exiles were basically, most of them resided in Kazakhstan or Uzbekistan, or Kyrgyzstan, etc. And those ones basically the centers of resistance against the Chinese rule at the time. However, after the Cold War, and then when the Central Asian state tried to patch up relations with the PRC, and then you had a Western movement of many of the exile groups, and then they first moved to Turkey, and many later on moved to Western Europe, to Germany, and etc. So that or to US, right? So it's essentially let's say the exile movement for the Uyghur cause still has very strong international dimension to them. So throughout these things, I've been trying to emphasize, obviously, is that you have this domestic, political, violence, the kind of story of suppression of minority rights, etc. But this itself is not necessarily sufficient conditions for active political resistance, and you need some type of material resources to mobilize those grievances for an active sort of campaign or movement to demand for a set of, like, say, self-determination or autonomy. And so that's the reason why external support is quite crucial to maintain or even sustain an active sort of group, active movement for its own, let's say, self-determination. And I think that is the story not only in the Chinese case, but also you can find many equivalents throughout the world. Now, the contemporary trends. So after some of discussions of broader strokes of how do we understand different patterns of identity contestation in the Chinese context, so how can we understand what's going on today, and what are the some of the broader themes or sort of phenomena that's happening. So first of all, as I said, is very much sort of national security or security as the excuse, or the trumps anything else, right? So there's little tolerance for political dissent, and often those political dissent are met with heavy repression. Now, there are different type of political dissent, right? But then again, the problem often is that political dissent, they are met with indiscriminate violence, and that is the problem. So you can think about dissent have different kind of scale, right? Let's say some probably say want independence, right? So which probably from state point of view that's not possible, right? So in some way, in some state, this is essentially a taboo as well. I guess in Spain probably something like that. But there are some kind of dissent probably is legitimate in a way that you can say, oh, we want more language education in Uyghur language or in Tibetan language, or probably some people say, oh, there are more the discrimination in terms of the job market. That's why we want more protection for locals in the job market, etc. These are things often probably they are legitimate. But then again, often these kind of legitimate dissent often were met with repression, right? And that often is the problem, that it's very hard to find, let's say, any type of dissent against the Chinese rule, particularly in Tibet and Xinjiang. Often any sense were sort of silenced, right? So that's the problem. And since 2005, there is a new legislation called anti-separatist law, and so ever since this legislation, and then essentially any person who might not even just say want independence, but rather than saying some kind of like cultural autonomy or some kind of minority rights, were often branded as separatist. Right, and so this kind of indiscriminate violence, which often led to the criminalization of people's, let's say, some are genuine, like in some way, rightful demand, right, for some kind of protection. But then again, they were criminalized and basically called as let's say separatist, right? So there is this kind of indiscriminate use of suppression against any type of dissent. And particularly in the Xinjiang's case, and ever since the global war on terror, and the Chinese state has been very heavily sort of utilizing this discourse and try to link the global, let's say, you can talk about Islamic radicalization, you can talk about the ISIS or ISIL in the Middle East and how they were sort of spreading throughout Pakistan and Afghanistan into China, etc. But then again, they often utilize this global discourse on war on terror and use that as a justification for the security measures that have been taken. They'll be implementing in Xinjiang, right? So, I mean, if you follow the news these days, right? So the amount of securitization in Xinjiang itself is much more so than any other places in China itself. You can find, let's say, very recent high technology of, let's say, face recognition. In terms of try to register everybody's face recognition into some kind of security camera, and then recently I saw on the news that essentially you can spot somebody just by see the camera and who you are, and then your whole background information will come up perhaps on a computer screen, right? So that is basically a high amount of state surveillance of the society, and then obviously this kind of high surveillance will eventually feed into further grievance and dissent, right? So this is essentially it's a vicious cycle that has been going on specifically in Xinjiang. This type of securitization is not as much in Tibet itself. But more so on Xinjiang. But probably Rémi later on will talk about the global sort of Islamic dimension to it. But then again, this is sort of securitization or the perceptions of let's say the connection between internal resistance with a global phenomenon of, let's say, Islamic fundamentalism, and definitely has been one of the questions that the Chinese government has been pushing. On the other hand, so this kind of political story aside, and that also emphasis try to further integrate the peripheral regions through the rest of China, or the more prosperous regions in the country through more economic integration, right? So economic integration from since 2010. Since 2000, there is let's say a national project called Western Development Program, essentially try to provide incentives to, let's say, from let's say subsidies and from reorientation of priorities for development projects, etc. Try to redirect the economy from the coastal regions to more inland provinces, right? And which also represent in general, like a general concern of the unbalance of the national economy. That means that the coastal provinces are much more developed than the inland provinces. So since that time, much of, let's say, some of the emphasis, particularly if the focus is on infrastructure development, basically building roads. So you have very extensive highway system has been being constructed in western part of China, but also in terms of the upgrade or constructions of railway connecting with Tibet, and also the railway connect Lanzhou with Urumqi, etc. So you have this kind of more integration in the sense that infrastructure development has been prioritized as the first step. Try to sort of more seamlessly sort of integrate the vast country into one. So on the other hand, there is the old strategies of, let's say, migration. When you don't have a demographic dominance, often that is the indication of weakness, right? So you need to have more of your own people in the more peripheral regions to secure your control. And so that's basically that means more migration, incentive for migration for Han Chinese to the peripheral regions, so which has been going on for the past decades. basically in Tibet itself, and also Xinjiang is more complicated essentially. That ever since 2009, because of the riot, actually the Han Chinese population percentage is going down. But overall, the pattern is that you want to encourage the Han Chinese to migrate to the peripheral regions and perhaps to set the business and settle there for a long period, and then basically they'll be able to secure the region. This is strategy not simply Chinese of doing this. Many other countries have done this, right? Israel's, they've done that all the time as well. Other Russians do the same thing. So this is often a common strategy of, you can say, demographic engineering, essentially, is that you want to make sure that the people living in the areas you don't think they have enough loyalty to become more loyal because you set your own people there. And that is the strategy that Chinese state has been doing for a long time. On the other hand, the more, let's say, economic integration, or let's say more migration of Han Chinese business people into the peripheral regions has led to more marginalization of the minorities in their own local economy. Now, there are lots of reasons why this marginalization occurred. Some part of it was perhaps just because of direct discrimination, right? So for example, you might actually, in the Chinese context, there's no national law against discrimination. So you can't actually discriminate, that's fine. So in a way that, you will easily find a job ad in China that will say that, okay, we don't want women, we don't want minorities, we don't want people whose age of over 30. It's clear, that's legitimate. It's not like you can sue them, you cannot say that at least you cannot say that, right? You can do that, in practice we cannot say that. But in the Chinese case, people do that all the time, right? So you will find those kind of direct discrimination in the job market that people say, basically saying that we don't want to hire ethnic minorities, we only want to hire Han Chinese. So this is kind of discrimination often basically are blatant, in your face kind of discrimination. And then there's also more subtle type of discrimination in the sense that people say, we want to hire people but who has good command of Mandarin. And then usually that is different kind of more subtle form of discrimination in the sense that perhaps usually that the minority population might not have the same type of standard in their Mandarin proficiency. And that is different ways you can probably screen out some of the, some of the candidates in your process. But what really means that, on the other hand, because the capital, mostly coming from the money, the capital for business often come from inland or from coastal or the China proper provinces, and usually that leads to basically the minorities have been marginalized in their own land, right? So this has been going on for the past few decades, and there is not really much measure has been taken on to address those issues, and this is is essentially one of the major grievances by the local population. Not everyone is political necessarily. Not everyone necessarily understands, let's say, some of the nationalistic kind of claims. But some of the economic grievances are genuine, right? It's in your daily life, and then that can often feed into people's grievances towards the society, towards Han Chinese, towards the state. On the other hand, there is very strong push for more assimilation culturally, try to make the different groups as different minorities as more sort of assimilated into the Han Chinese. So in a sense that, on the one hand, there is some push for bilingual education reform. So in the situations of Tibetan regions, as well as in Xinjiang itself, that previously in some areas you have, let's say, the school system will predominantly be taught in Uyghur, and then you taught one subject in Chinese, which is the Chinese language, right? But then these days, some of the effort tries to switch that, basically is teach every subject in Chinese, but teach one language course in Uyghur. So which obviously will shift the whole balance of the importance of language in local curriculum, right? So that is still ongoing. Some areas has been carried out, some areas has faced resistance and state basically sort of suspended this kind of reform. But ultimately, that is the goal, is essentially try to assimilate everybody into one. There's also continued discrimination and stereotyping of minorities. Particularly, this is towards the Uyghurs and Tibetans only, in a sense that, let's say, sometimes, it's if you are a Tibetan or Uyghur, you travel to other parts of China, usually you face more sort of surveillance, right? It's much harder for you to, let's say, sort of check in a hotel, and etc. There's lots of more policies being implemented in a way that might, carried out direct sort of discrimination against or stereotype minority as criminals or as terrorists and etc. So there is that kind of like stereotyping going on, profiling of the minorities. But then again, many of those push for assimilation often has some barriers, and these barriers, and I will argue, is much more significant in the Uyghur case, or in many of the Central Asian groups' case. This is partly to do with this sort of contradiction in the Chinese case. On the one hand, the Chinese state claims itself as, let's say, multi-ethnic and multinational, etc. But on the other hand, there is a very strong sense of, let's say, racial purity in the sense that the Chinese state, on the one hand, will actually often claim itself as, let's say, the yellow race, right? I mean, if you think about many of the Chinese nationalistic propaganda, often will emphasize of this sort of, the yellow race, and that's what China is the symbol of the yellow, and etc. Right? So that means basically that for some groups it's actually easy to pass. And so imagine you are a Tibetan, even a Mongolian, that if you speak perfect Mandarin, people might not even know you are a minority. But this is not possible in many of the Central Asian population. If you're Uyghur, you look different. So even if you speak perfect Mandarin, you'll be spotted as different. And this kind of physical, let's say, phenomenological kind of differences is actually very clear. And then that has roots in the racial origins of Chinese nationalism. So there is contradiction between this, on one hand, this emphasis of multi-ethnic sort of nationalism, and then on the other hand is this racial origins of Chinese nationalism. Right, so one of the readings I sent you, to Chiara, has this kind of discussion about race. So the racial dimension has been going on ever since the late 19th century. That as a response to Western European colonial expansions in Asia, and this emphasis of the yellow race has to rise up, and then have some solidarity with each other. But that has continued today, even that the Chinese understandings of what constitutes a proper Chinese is often a yellow Asiatic look, other than some who might be from different racial stock, which probably is the case in many of the Xinjiang Central Asian population. And this kind of barrier is much more difficult to overcome than otherwise. On the other hand, I think I'm finishing very soon, yeah? Okay, all right. So on the other hand, recently there are some discussions of policy reform. Now, what does it mean? Because of the 2008 in Tibet and 2009 in Xinjiang, these two major riots were quite sort of transformative in a way that it really set up a new round of debate of what went wrong. Right? So obviously, I think there is, even though the state will deny, but then usually people will know there is some genuine problems of actually the minority policy did not really work. You have a strong sense of dissent, at least among the Tibetans and Uyghurs, etc. So so what is the reason why there is such a strong dissent, and what you can do to make it better, right? So many of the, let's say, the international community, particularly, let's say, you have Tibetan exile groups or the Uyghur exile groups, etc. Often, many of those groups would demand for, some are more radical. They want independence, right? There are also other ones more moderate. Perhaps will say they want autonomy, but have a more genuine application of Chinese law on autonomy. So the 1982 law on regional autonomy I mentioned earlier actually has more ambitious sort of items included in itself. but just not actively enforced. Right? So some of the scholars will argue that if you actually carry out those promises in your legislation, then you'll be fine. Right? So that's basically one side of the argument. On the other hand, there are many internal, like domestic sort of voices basically saying that the reason why the Chinese policies towards ethnic minorities has not really been successful was because of the model they borrowed was a bad one. That's because the Soviet model was the problem, right? So look at Soviet Union, look at that. Soviet Union collapsed, and all its former republics are become independent. So obviously that is the root cause of, because this is a bad model. So instead, they should borrow from the Americans. The Americans basically saying, oh, we can, essentially is melting pot, right? You want to make everybody the same. So there is that kind of discussion right now among some policy circles, basically saying that the Chinese regional autonomy should be abolished. Instead, or people's ID card and your ethnic identification should be eliminated. So basically, everybody should be treated equal in a sense, like the American style. But obviously, in the US, you know, officially, you don't have such, let's say, regional autonomy, but or let's say protections. Well, that's protection of minority rights, but still, the amount of violence committed by the state towards certain minorities is tremendous, right? And resistance of that sort of, let's say, segregation. You can talk about discrimination on every aspect is still ongoing. So I don't know whether that is a good policy, good model or not. But anyway, there is still ongoing debates within China in terms of what went wrong. And often people don't really, people are not likely to admit they had mistakes. Often they sort of try to point fingers at somebody else, right? So usually people say, well, it's because of sabotage by some kind of evil foreign forces. And some people basically say that because we had a bad model, that's why if we do a much better model, then we'd be fine. But often, some of the entrenched, let's say, stereotypes or discriminations have not really been addressed. Right? And then I will argue that in the Chinese society today, there's still not really any discussion of, let's say, minority rights in a very open sort of sphere, a kind of public sphere. Right? There's no sense of discussion of, let's say, discrimination, right, of any kind. Right? And so the society has not really progressed or has not really reached the level that you can discuss about diversity. Not simply ethnic diversity, but any type of diversity, right? So that this kind of discussion have always been silenced, right? So so these are the issues that I would argue that if you want to have a genuine facing up to the reality of how to deal with different people's grievances and why the reason why people have this kind of demand for language sort of autonomy or a different kind of religious expression, then overall there is genuine lack of compassion in many of the majority Han Chinese to understand what is going on among the other people, right? And that is, I would say, a societal problem in a way. That is this lack of sort of let's say, these kind of open discussions of diversity. And I think this is essentially the initial steps to be taken for any sort of genuine, let's say, progress on let's say, accommodation or even more sort of equal and more sort of harmonious society in a way, right? And I will stop here. It's almost an hour. Okay. Yeah, and then, but obviously, I think I went through quite a lot of materials, and then, and I will be very happy, perhaps now take questions from students.
Maybe we can have a coffee break now.
Okay.
Since your lectures are in a way related.
Okay.
We can join the Q&A.
Okay, sure.
And just
Yeah. All right. Sounds good. Okay.
Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you.
Bueno, buenos días a todas y a todos. Continuamos con la segunda sesión de la Escuela de Primavera. Remapping as Studies, y en este caso contamos con la presencia del profesor Rémi Castets de la Universidad de Burdeos. Voy a hacer una breve presentación del profesor Castets, que estudió política, se diplomó, obtuvo su diplomatura en estudios políticos en la Universidad de Burdeos en el año 1996, y a partir de ahí ha realizado diferentes tareas de investigación en el Instituto Nacional de Lenguas y Civilizaciones Orientales en el INALCO, en la que perfeccionó y doctoró sus estudios asiáticos, y ha realizado diferentes estancias de investigación tanto en la República Popular China, en la Universidad de Nankín en el año 1998-99, como en la Universidad Yadong de Xi'an en el año 2001-2002. Desde el año 2006 está adscrito a la Universidad de Burdeos, al Departamento de Estudios Chinos, y está también asociado al programa de investigación de Asia Occidental de George Washington University. Sus principales líneas de investigación, y lo podemos comprobar ahora en su presentación aquí, están vinculadas a cuestiones ideológicas, de historia política del mundo chino, y evidentemente a los elementos, cuestiones vinculadas a minorías periféricas o periferización de minorías dentro de la República Popular China. Quiero agradecer, como antes hacíamos con el profesor Enze, en este caso con el profesor Rémi Castets, que haya apostado por participar en este proyecto desde el principio, confiando en nosotros, y como siempre decimos, este solo es el inicio de una futura bonita gran amistad. En cualquier caso, gracias por estar aquí.
Gracias, Antonio. Bueno, quisiera agradecerte, y Chiara, es realmente un placer para mí estar con vosotros. Bueno, me hubiera encantado hacer una ponencia en castellano, pero bueno, hace años que no he hablado su idioma y pienso que sería muy arriesgado hacerla en castellano. Pues perdóname, voy a hacer mi presentación en inglés, perdóname mi acento francés, voy a intentar hablar un inglés correcto, y si bueno, no comprende lo que digo, levanta la mano y dime, bueno, puede reexplicar, o lo haré con mucho placer. So I switched to English. First, I wanted to say that the presentation of Enze was really brilliant. You know, it was a wonderful synthesis on the question of nationalities in China. I rarely listen such a great synthesis on the issue. So it's quite comfortable for me to go on now on the Uyghur issues, because Enze has presented the main context dealing with this ethnic policy in China. So like Enze, I will add also that, sorry, maybe I'll get to talk in the mic. I will add I'm giving the opinion of a researcher, of somebody who tried to follow a scientific way to explain things. And science is not the delivering of truth. It's just quite a sort of consensus at a certain moment in a scientific field. So what I'm going to express is my intent to interpret the situation. But well, if you do not share the same opinion, it's not a problem at all. We can have a debate. The nature of science is to be an open debate, you know, as long as we use a scientific method and logical discourse well. So I'm going to try to synthesize in 1 hour an history of Uyghur modern anti-colonialism. I've done something that researchers should never do, what is to change the title or a little bit the content of a presentation. I was thinking at the origin of making something more focused on the Uyghur Islamist scene, but I think considering the program you are following, it was maybe more useful to broaden this approach and to speak more globally of this Uyghur political opposition, who was quite unknown until the late 90s, early 2000. So I will speak about Islamic movements and about the jihadist movement, especially the Turkestan Islamic Party and its genesis. But I will speak also about the nationalist opposition, which constitute actually the majority of the militants in the world, because you will understand that now most of the militants, they are in the diaspora. Enze explained that now in Xinjiang the context is quite repressive, and it has changed drastically since the late 80s, and so now most of the militants, they are abroad. So maybe you heard about Xinjiang, and often Xinjiang is associated to unrest. Unrest in China is quite a sensitive area in China. Enze has spoken about history. Maybe I will give a few words to understand why Chinese state is very cautious in the management of this region. So you see a few pictures of the riots in Urumqi in 2009. And as Enze said, I think there is a before 2009 and after 2009, because after those riots, the tensions between the Han and the Uyghurs have in a way escalated. And after those events in 2009, there have been a rise of violence in Xinjiang. There had a former rise of violence in the 90s, but since the late 90s and with the policies of control of the Chinese state, this violence had decreased, and we have seen a new increase of violence after 2009. These are pictures of, on the left, it's terrible to show those pictures, but of what happened in Kunming in 2014. Nearly 13 people have been stabbed by Uyghurs, and on the right of a terrorist attack in Urumqi nearly the same year. So we will try to understand who are the Uyghurs and what is the ideological background of the Uyghurs who try to seek for a greater autonomy or independence. So you have here a few figures of Uyghur anti-colonialism. For example, on the on your left, I have to to be careful. It's not the same. So on the left, you have Rabia Kadir, who has been the head of the World Uyghur Congress until now, even if for a few months now, a young Uyghur leader now has risen in this structure, and who is now she's kind of honorary president of this structure. But also on the upper part, you have Issa Yusuf Abtekin and Mehmet Hemed Bougra, who are two very important personalities in the history of Uyghur anti-colonialism, who are those people who were heavily influenced by an ideology I will present you in a few minutes. I mean Jadidism, who is a kind of who is linked to pan-Turkism. Okay, I will explain you the issues. You've got in the also Ilham Tohti. So on the left here, who has been a militant, advocating reforms and change in the policies led or set up by the Chinese state. And you have also with the turban Abdul Haq, who is the leader of the Turkestan Islamic Party, a very small group at the beginning, but which has been expanding and which is linked to Al-Qaeda, and is very active now in northwestern Syria, fighting with Al-Qaeda networks. And it's a phenomenon, this rise of the Uyghur Islamism, who was at the beginning quite marginal, and now is starting a bit worrying the nationalist militants who have been dominating the Uyghur anti-colonial scene. But now they are seeing that this rise of Islamist Uyghurs has a danger, because they are developing also the influence inside the diaspora slowly. but they are in an expanding trend. So I wanted just to talk, we're going to talk about ideology. So we got maybe to have a few words on the way human beings think the world. Ideology or a system of thought that's, we will see, try to think what should be the best way to organize economy, politics, society, etc. So just a few words about the way we produce thinking in order to understand why we become ideologized, actually. So human beings are special animals, you know, whose behavior partly depends on their ability to produce meaning. Max Weber or other specialists in social science have worked on this issue. And so we represent the world through concepts and ideas. And we are very special animals because we are the only animals who ask those questions about why and because, you know. And so we capitalize the meaning we produce through what we call cultural systems. We can discuss those issues during the questions. And it's a product of an evolutionary strategy. You know, neuropsychologists like Antonio Damasio have written on those issues. So it's a kind of a star now of neuropsychology in the US. We produce meaning through an analogical and analogical and symbolic process. That means we compare to think. You know, actually we do not innovate that much. We just compare situation we have seen or ideas we have listened to with the reality, and that's the way we produce sense. And so human beings mostly rely on cultural meaning tanks. That can be religion, for example, ideologies, art, whatever, and we mix that together to produce our own system of sense, our own system of interpretation of the world. So if you think just a few minutes, when we think, we just think about producing meaning, actually. All the thinking processes are linked to that, actually. We try to explain, to optimize our behavior, actually. Third thing I wanted to say, the production of meaning, and that's very important when we speak about ideology, is mostly determined by an imbalance between representation of self-interest and social interest or constraints. Lots of authors have worked on that. Dan Sperber, a current, big current inside anthropology, which is called interactionist symbolism, also has worked on the issues. And in political science, for example, Benedict Anderson or Anthony Smith, you know, have worked on those issues. Also, we can discuss that later if needed. So, Clifford Geertz told us it's the convergence of a social psychological tension and the absence of cultural resources to give meaning to this tension, each one exacerbating the other, which prepare the rise of systematic ideologies, whatever they are, political, moral, or economic. So what I mean is we adhere to an ideology because we have problems to solve. And usually when those ideology are not the ideology followed by the states, we choose them because we consider the state is not able to solve our problems. That's why we start following opposition political movements, because there is an economic, a social, an ethnic problem we consider the state will never solve, okay? So, those things said, let's speak about the Uyghurs. Just a few words maybe about who are they, and then we will try to understand why they mobilize, some of the Uyghurs mobilize against the Chinese state. So I will just say a few words about the ethnogenesis, the Islamization, and the relation of East Turkestan Oasis and China. East Turkestan is the name of Xinjiang according to nationalists and Islamists among the Uyghurs, because they consider they do not belong to the Chinese world, they are Turks, and what the Chinese have called Xinjiang after they conquered it in the 18th century, they consider that Xinjiang is the eastern part of Turkestan, the western part being the former space integrated to the Soviet Union and who has got independence after 1991. Sorry. So I just wanted to show you a few maps of the Muslim population in the world, and look at the map on my left, which is a map, an anamorphosis of the Muslim population in the world. And what is interesting, actually, we can see that most of the Muslims, they do not live in the Middle or in the Near East, but they live in Asia, actually. They live in Asia, and you see China, which is a big country, you know, you can barely, it's difficult to see it. It's at the north of Bangladesh and India, you know. Well, no, I'm too small, I cannot show you, but it's about China, about 20 to 25, officially 20 to 25 million Muslim people. So, this Muslim population actually is scattered into nearly tens, I cannot remember, yeah, I think it's something like 10 ethnic groups. And you can see in that figure that nearly half of them, half of those Muslims are constituted by the Hui, which are Muslim, Chinese-speaking Muslims. And the other part, nearly the other half of those Muslim minorities are constituted by Turkic-speaking minorities. There are a few Mongol-speaking minorities and a small Tajik-speaking minority in China, but they are not so numerous. So the Uyghurs are the main Turkic-speaking nationality in China. Their population is now, those figures are from 2000. According to the last figures, now there are something like 10 million people. Okay, but the proportion today are nearly the same, even if the Uyghur population is increasing a bit more quickly than the Hui population. So let's have a look to a map, and you can see Xinjiang, you know, is a northwestern part of China. It's a territory 3 times as big as France, right? So something like 1.5 million square kilometers, with a population of something like 20 million people. Okay, and you can see in the upper part. Sorry, some of my maps are in French, so I will try to translate a bit the main data on those maps. But on the upper map, you can see the repartition, the geographical repartition of the nationalities in Xinjiang, and you can see the Uyghurs. In short, they mainly live around the Tarim Basin, I mean in the south of Xinjiang province, and in the east, in the Turfan Komul area. And there are also a few Uyghurs living in the north, near the frontier of Kazakhstan, in the Ili Valley, in the region of Khulja, you know. Well, so a few words about the history of the region. Actually, Chinese civilization has developed from the northern plains, you know, that means the region between around the Yellow rivers, and you can see with the upper map the different phases of extension of the Chinese state, you know, and so the expansion in Central Asia started after the discovering of the Silk Roads by the Emperor Han Wudi in the 2nd century before Jesus Christ. And when China had that opportunity, she had tried to control, Chinese emperor, Chinese dynasty have tried to control those Silk Roads. It was linked to geopolitical issues. The problem of Chinese emperor was the threat of the nomadic confederation from Mongolia. So during the Han dynasty, the main threat was coming from the Xiongnu, who was a kind of proto-Turkic or proto-Altaic confederation. And so for the Chinese emperor, controlling the Silk Roads was important because it was a way of reducing the power of those nomad people from the steppes, from Mongolia. Because if the Chinese were not in control of that region, those people could get taxes from the trade links, from the trade exchanges on those Silk Roads. So the Chinese prefer to control that in order to weaken those tribes from Mongolia who were really a big threat for the Chinese. That's the reason why they have been building the Great Wall, actually, to protect them from. So China had the power to control, actually, this section of the Silk Roads. I mean, the sections around present-day Xinjiang, I mean, around the Taklamakan Desert, during the Han Dynasty. And shortly during the Sui-Tang Dynasty, I mean, between the 7th and the middle of the 8th century. Just maybe a last word of what happened in the 8th century. During the 8th century, you know, the Chinese, the Tang Dynasty has lost a big battle, which is called the Talas battle. Talas is now in present-day Kazakhstan. And Chinese Tang Dynasty has lost this battle against a coalition between the Arabs and those nomadic Turk. So I forgot to tell you that during that time, during the 7th, 8th century, the big coalition, the big confederation that was posing a threat to China in Mongolia were the Turks. We were not speaking, the Xiongnu had disappeared, and the Turks were the main power in the region. So they lost this battle, and after that, Chinese influence on Central Asia has disappeared until, not totally, but barely totally disappeared until the Qing dynasty. Of course, China has kept commercial and trade links with the little kingdoms of Central Asia. There was also this kind of diplomatic, Chinese traditional diplomatic system, what was called the tribute system. Well, I won't go into that. We can discuss that also after and speak about that. So I wanted to, after having spoken about those links in pre-modern China between China and Xinjiang, present-day Xinjiang, I just want to say a few days about the ethnogenesis of the Uyghurs. Few people know that actually western part of China were populated by Indo-European people. So Indo-European come from Central Asia, and a few of them have migrated to India, the Iranian world, and to Europe. You know, the first Indo-European arriving to Europe were the Celtic people who were in Spain, in France, England, and Germany, etc. But a branch of those Indo-European people who have mixed with local people moved to Western China, I mean present-day Xinjiang. And those people were known by the Greeks, because when Alexander conquered the world, he has stopped at the frontier of present-day Xinjiang. And those people were called the Tocharians. And those Tocharians were Indo-European people. We found their mummies inside the desert of Xinjiang, and they are wearing clothes similar to the Celtic people and whatever. So during the first millennium of our era, the Turk people started migrating from Mongolia, because the Turk, they do not come from Turkey, but from Mongolia, actually. And those Turks started mixing with those Indo-European people, and actually the Uyghurs are the result, the present-day Uyghurs are Turcicide population, and are the result of this mixture in between Indo-European and Turkic population. You have on the other map in the lower part of the diaporama, a map of the Turkic people now in Asia, and you see the Uyghurs form the eastern branch of this Turkic world. It's important because when we'll speak about Pan-Turkism and Jadidism, you will see it had a heavy influence on the way Uyghurs see them as a nation at the beginning of the 20th century. Okay. So that's why, for example, among the Uyghurs, you don't have any morphological types. You have some Uyghurs like the old man who really look like Indo-European. For example, this guy is, I think it's a photo taken around Khotan or Kashgar, and you see people looking like nearly like us, like Western people. And you have a young Uyghur girl who has really have Asian morphology, like people coming from the steppes. And because originally the Turkic people, they were Asian people, you know, and they have mixed after with other population. So what is feeding frustrations and anti-colonial feeling today among the Uyghurs? So as I told you before, you know, the reason why we follow an ideology, whatever it's a nationalist ideology or, I don't know, economical ideology, liberalism or Marxism or Islamism, I mean Salafism or whatever, is because we have problem, you know, we have the feeling there are problems that are not solved by the state or by the authorities. So we will try to see, but Enze has talked about this, so I will go very quickly, about the main reason feeding Uyghur political mobilization. Well, we'll see there are four main reasons, there are other, but four main reasons, which are demographic colonization of Xinjiang and its socio-economic impact. The question of the autonomy also of Xinjiang, as Enze has explained, the autonomy actually is in a way deactivated by the strict control of the Chinese Communist Party over a regional institution. There is an issue also of the Sinicization of the scholar system, but Enze also spoken about this bilingual education, who is seen by the Uyghurs as an intent to Sinicize them, but the Chinese state say, okay, but if you want to enter the economy and to be part of the economy, you have to speak Chinese language, so it's a question of point of view, actually. Yeah. And you have the issue since the 90s of the strict control on political discourse, culture, and also the practice and teaching of Islam. Well, so just wanted to show you a few slides. First, on the first issue, the demographic colonization and its socio-economic impact. So actually, Xinjiang have seen a huge evolution of its ethnic imbalance, you know. For example, in Xinjiang, you have a structure called the Xinjiang Production and Construction Corps, which is aimed at allowing Chinese migrants from the rest of China to settle in Xinjiang. So, for example, now 1/3 of the Han living in Xinjiang, they belong to those corps, and they allow newcomers to set up in the region. You have good wages, good social protection now. So it's a kind of catalyst of Han immigration in Xinjiang. So today the ethnic imbalance is the following. Now you have according to the 2010 population census, you had 22 million inhabitants in Xinjiang. Among them, the Uyghurs form 45% of the population, the Han something like around 40%, and Kazakh, Hui, and etc., etc. So, but for the problem for the Uyghurs is that they were constituting before the arrival of the Chinese Communist Party the majority of the population of Xinjiang. Just maybe I will show you the next slide, maybe this one. So it's this slide shows the evolution of the ethnic imbalance in Xinjiang between 1949 and 2000. And in the purple color, you have the Uyghurs. And the Uyghurs in 1949, they were representing 3/4 of the population. And now they just represent 45%. So they consider themselves as the main autochthonous nationality, but they considered now that the Han arriving in Xinjiang are threatening this original ethnic imbalance, even if this ethnic imbalance has always evolved during time. But that's the way they see things. And you can see in yellow the part of the Han people inside the population of Xinjiang increasing steadily along the 50 or 60 last years. So, for example, if you look at the right part of the slide, you can see that Xinjiang is the region who has seen the most important increase of the Han population in Western China. Look at Tibet. We always speak about Tibet, but actually the Han people, they were nearly 0% of the population in 1953. But now, officially in the autonomous region of Tibet, they are officially under 10%. Well, we can discuss those figures. But look at Xinjiang, you know, the population, the Han population was something like 7-8% in 1953. And now they're representing barely 40% of the population of Xinjiang. So it's a huge modification of ethnic imbalance. And so you can see on the right part of the diaporama, you can see the slide, you can see that the Han people now are becoming a majority in the northern part and eastern part of Xinjiang. The southern part is still mainly populated by Uyghurs, but the increase of Han is quite quick in some of those prefectures. The problem is the Chinese state, to encourage this immigration, is making lots of investment. A huge part of the region budget is constituted by transfer of the central government to develop, as Enze said, infrastructure, industry, and etc., etc. And those funds, they are focused on the area the state is targeting to develop colonization. So in a way, it's injecting lots of money in the area mainly populated by Han people, and the Uyghurs feel that their prefectures, they don't receive the same amount of money, and there are inequalities, income, GDP, gross domestic product inequalities, and income inequalities between the areas dominated by Han and Uyghurs. That's what you can see in the upper part of the slide. And you can see the region where the Han are in majority, in yellow, in pink, in orange, you know, have higher level of GDP per inhabitant. Yeah. And in gray, the region where the Uyghurs live have lower GDP per inhabitant. So this is creating vicious circle, you know, and for example, now since the reform, you know, if you want your children to follow studies, for example, at university, of course, there are scholarship system in China, but they are not so numerous, and the Uyghurs who are poorer than the Han have a lower access to, for example, university. You can check those statistics. For example, national minorities in Xinjiang in 2001 were representing something like 60% of the population of the province, but they were only constituting 43% of the students at university. So that means the Han, who are barely 40% of the Xinjiang population, they barely constitute 60% of the students at university. And plus, there is the problem now that the economy now is dominated by the Han, and the Han, they prefer, of course, to hire Han people than Uyghurs because of, as Enze said, you know, cultural stereotypes. Now there's a fear also of the Han people, of the Uyghurs, since what happened during the past years, and the Uyghurs are a bit scary sometimes for some Han people. And those Uyghurs who have studied to university have often difficulties to find jobs in Xinjiang. So those people say, okay, we play the game, we have learned Chinese, we have studied in Chinese university, but when we come back, who get the job? It's Chinese people who get the job, and we are unemployed in our region. So they feel they are kind of second-class citizen in their homeland. And when you have this feeling, you are ready to enter anti-colonialist thinkings and movements. Plus, a last factor now is because we will see of the politicization of Islam. There's a very strict control on Islam, and the Uyghurs, even a part of the Uyghur society, is not are not great practices. I mean, they do not practice Islam that much, and lots of Uyghurs, they are laïc, they are secular, they don't go to the mosque. But those who really believe in Islam, they feel very frustrated because the system of control of Islam is very strict. For example, now there are lots of measures who are, to my opinion, totally counterproductive. You know, women are forbidden for wearing scarves. You cannot pray anymore in public places. For example, you can see, you know, in the slide, disposition in an hospital, you know, where they say it's forbidden to pray in the hospital. So there is a kind of paranoia around Islam, which was in a way legitimate, but who is going to my way too far, you know, and which is, to my opinion, now becoming counterproductive because the Uyghurs feel their Islamic identity is under attack from the Chinese state. Well, we can discuss that also later. So now, for example, the teaching of Islam is very strictly controlled by the state. You have a map. Now you can only study Islam in Quranic school, I mean Quranic institute, ruled by the state with a heavy ideological teachings, you know. And so the imam who are coming from those institutes sometimes, they are not so legitimate because people think they are more, those imams are more representative of the Chinese Communist Party than real specialist or real theologian, you know, Islamic theologian. Well. So, what about those Uyghurs who mobilized against the Chinese state? So I will just apply the model of Anthony Smith to Xinjiang, actually. And so Anthony Smith has developed a model to try to explain what ideological reactions colonialism generates among the colonized people. So, according to his model, during the modern time, the modern period, modern times is the period of time where science has become, you know, the cultural system who are start to structure people's mind and people's system of interpretation of the world. Modernity is the opposite of tradition. Before this development of modern thinking, people were thinking the world through other cultural meaning tanks. I mean, the main one was religion, okay? So, during the modern time, those modern colonialist countries have expanded, and they have generated, you know, reactions, ideological reaction when they have tried to integrate in their nation other people from the margin. From the margin in China, those people will be the Tibetan, the Mongol, the Uyghurs, etc. So there's a first reaction, which is the reaction of the people who have the power in the traditional society. That's what we call the anti-modern people. Because in the traditional societies, you know, usually clergymen and local notability, you know, they have the monopoly of the interpretation of the world, even if they do not have the political power. For example, in Xinjiang, the political power was in the hand of the Qing dynasty, the Manchu dynasty, who had conquered Xinjiang in the middle 18th century. But there have been a kind of indirect administration rule in Xinjiang, and those clergymen and this local notability had kept a kind of power on the society. And those people, you know, they have seen the modern people, the modern ideology, as system that would destroy this traditional order, and they will lose their prerogative, they will lose their power. You know, when you are an imam in a traditional society, you are the one who is advising the people when they have problems, and you can capitalize this knowledge, and you can receive money for that. People, when they die, you receive inheritance from those people. They give you lands and etc. For example, in Xinjiang, the mosque and the Sufi lodges, we can discuss about Sufism, because Islam in Xinjiang was dominated by Sufism until the 20th century. So they had huge amount of lands thanks to this monopoly of the interpretation of the world. So those people, they will refuse those ideologies. So they are the anti-moderns. They are a second category of people who will accept the idea of modernity and will be total believers of modernity, and they will try to follow the path of the creation of the totally new society who is developing itself through the science discourse, who will develop itself using positivist way of thinking, technical progress, and etc. So, for example, in Xinjiang, those people who Anthony Smith called the assimilationists will be the pro-Sovietic communist circles or the pro-Chinese communist circles. Even if things are more complex in Xinjiang, because even if those people were pro-Sovietic and were believing in the concept of Homo Sovieticus, which is kind of new model of man and society linked to the building of communist societies, they will still keep a kind of national anti-colonialist background who is influenced by as Enze said, by the Sovietic theory of nationalities. And we have a third category of ideological reaction, which is the reaction of what we call anti-colonialists, who were not split, but who were divided, maybe, I cannot find the right word in English, in two scenes who were collaborating. Those two scenes were the Jadid reformist scene and the Muslim reformist scene. Actually, they had in common a same vision about modernity. For the Jadid, who are known in Europe as pan-Turkists, they had the feeling that the Turkic world, had to adapt itself to modernity, and they were thinking that in order to liberate themselves from colonization from the Russian in the Russian Empire, from the Chinese in Xinjiang, they had to import the scientific discourse and the technical progress from the West, but without abandoning their culture. So they refused to assimilate. For example, in Russia, you had part of the Tatar elites, or the Tatar were Turkic people, who had totally been Russified. They had abandoned their Turkic culture, and they had Russified. But those people say, no, we should protect our culture. And if we want our culture to survive, we have to adopt those modern ideas in order to develop education. So they were promoters of modern education, what we call in Uyghur Pani Mektep, which means scientific schools. And they were considering that this development of education will allow also through the control of the teaching of history, literature, to develop the national feeling among the Turkic people. So those people actually, they were the very first promoter of anti-colonialism in Xinjiang, and they started developing in the early 20th century until 1949. Well, the history of Xinjiang is ultra complex between the early 20th century and 1949. So I won't go into detail, but what happened when the Chinese Communist Party arrived in the region, those people have migrated because they were repressed by the power because they were anti-colonialist, and most of them have migrated to Turkey. There was a second wing, ideological wing, that developed in Xinjiang in, let's say, the 20s, 30s, but mostly in the 30s, and it was a pro-Soviet nationalist wing. I put nationalists into bracket because those people were at the crossroad between Marxism and nationalism. And it's very interesting because I've discussed with some of those people who now are living in Kazakhstan and things like that. And of course, in the 30s, in the 20s, they were more Marxist than nationalist. But which is very funny now when they reinterpret their political trajectory. They say, of course, they were also anti-colonialist and nationalist, but they couldn't express their nationalist feeling because it was non-politically correct among the Marxists to say that you were also nationalist and defending a national identity. Okay, because for Marxism, nationalism is a tool of domination used by the capitalist system to control the population. So those people actually, they were communists, but pro-Soviet communists. And many of them were defending the idea either of not independence of Xinjiang, but the integration of Xinjiang to the Soviet Union, or an integration to China, but with a huge autonomy. And the problem is those people have been disappointed during the 50s, because when Mao Zedong has developed this system of autonomy in Xinjiang, those people have realized that the institution of the autonomous region were still under the control of the Chinese Communist Party. The problem, in this system of autonomy in China is that, okay, you have regional institutions who are on the paper under the control of presidents or local governments who represent the minorities, but those local governments are under the control of the Chinese Communist Party. And the Chinese Communist Party is itself under the control of Han people, who most of the time are chosen in Beijing. So actually the center of power is not the local institution, the regional government, but the local communist power. And in Xinjiang, most of the time, the communist power was in the firm hands of Han people, obeying to the lines who were given to them in Beijing. So actually, those two wings were in a strong opposition, because actually the second wing, the pro-Soviet wing, was a tool of Stalin against Pan-Turkism. Because for the Soviet Union, the main danger in Central Asia was Pan-Turkism, because those Pan-Turkist people were thinking they were belonging to the same Turkic nation, to one nation, who was federating all the Turkic people. And Stalin had to fight against those pan-Turkic ideas in Central Asia. It's what we call the Basmachi rebellion, who was smashed down in the late 20s. There are lots of Basmachi. Then after have migrated to Xinjiang, they have integrated the pan-Turkic circles in Xinjiang. So it was a way for Stalin to developing the theory of nationalities was a way of breaking this Turkic nation into smaller nations. So from that time, the Soviet Union and China has promoted other system of national identities, where the Turkic people were split into Uyghur, Kazakh, Uzbek, Kyrgyz, Turkmen, etc., etc. And so they were, until the end of the Cold War, a very strong opposition between those pro-Soviet Uyghurs and those pan-Turkic Uyghurs. The pro-Soviet, they have migrated, some of them have migrated to Soviet Central Asia from the 50s onward. As Enze said, the regime was quite tolerant at the beginning and became more repressive against any ideas who were not fitting with the Communist Party discourse, and those people have migrated to Central Asia. And then after the independence of Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, they have started developing association militant association supporting the idea of independence of Xinjiang. They dropped the Marxist side of their thinking to become nationalists, defending the idea of a Uyghur nation. And the difference between the anti-colonialist scene in Turkey and Central Asia, it's a caricature, I simplified the thing, but was the level of the nation. For the people in Central Asia, there was a Uyghur nation they were calling Uyghuristan, the land of the Uyghurs. And for the people in Turkey, this nation was East Turkestan, so the eastern part of this vast Turkic nation. And for the people in Turkey, the jihadists, they were relying on the solidarity with other Turkic people. And for the nationalist Uyghurs from Central Asia or Xinjiang, there was this pan-Turkic feeling was not that strong. So those two scenes, actually, the Uyghur opposition nationalist wing was in fighting during decades. And after the falling of the Soviet Union, and they started talking together, exchanging, and to find a way to unify themselves and to coordinate themselves. But there were strong conflicts between personal ambitions, and they were able to unify in 2004 under the umbrella of the World Uyghur Congress, which is based in Washington, D.C., and which is very close to the American government. They are funded by the National Endowment for Democracy. And in a way, they represent now this nationalist Uyghur opposition who openly reject violence as a means to fight for independence. They have, in a way, followed the Tibetan path. So the idea is to conquer the Western opinions and to try to win the support of Western governments by promoting non-violent fight and defending human rights for the Uyghurs. That's their political stance, because they have understood that promoting terrorism or armed fight would expose them to a negative way of thinking and could be useful to the Chinese state that would try to assimilate them to the international terrorist scene, even if ideologically they don't have the same way of things that's than the Islamists. So I still have 10 minutes, something like that, okay, 10 to 15 minutes. So I will maybe go on with a part of this anti-colonial scene, which is the Islamist scene. So those are people, actually, they are monopolizing the attention of the media. But I have to say that actually, I've spent years among those Uyghur militants, and they are a small minority. But of course, the rise of those movements and their integration now with Al-Qaeda networks pose a main security threat for China. And even for Western government, who now are getting suspicious about this movement, who was at the origin only targeting China, but since he had integrated Al-Qaeda, he has integrated now international jihadist ideology, whose aim is not to fight China, but is to fight all non-Muslim or non-Muslim countries and or countries for government who are not in the same ideological line as them, because they also fight against Egyptian government or whatever, as long as they do not show their Salafi view of interpretation of Islam and etc. So by Islamist movement, so we will understand any movement led by intellectual benefiting from a modern education, whose aim is to build, starting with the power of the state, a global political system which will manage all aspects of the society and the economy, founding its authority only on Islam and rejecting any political pluralism. It's a definition of my director of thesis, Olivier Roy. So those people actually in Central Asia were at the origin people who are quite open to Western thinking. Because people think that Islamism, so when we speak about Islamism now, everybody think about Salafism, okay? Salafism is the main ideological tank for political Islam. But most of the founder of the Salafi thinking in the 19th century, Jalaluddin al-Afghani, Mohammed Abdu, were people who have spent time in the West and were open to the Western culture. But the difference was with Western modernism, the difference was they wanted to accept everything in Western modernity that was not contrary to their interpretation of Islam, actually. So actually Salafism and Muslim reformism was a way to integrate modernity inside Muslim societies, but the point was also to avoid Westernization. They wanted to build a modern culture that was relying on their very strict interpretation of Islam, because Salafism comes from the Arabic language Salaf. Salaf are the main companions of the Prophet, and so they considered that Islam was pure until the 7th, 8th century. And then after Islam started to degenerate, and those people tried to promote an interpretation of Islam they believe that is in accordance with the Islam of the very early time, actually. And they reject any other interpretation of Islam. So those people were not against modernity. People think often they are traditionalists. No, they were not traditionalists. They were not against modernity. They were not against modern education. They were just against Westernization. They were against Western colonialism. So Salafism is a reaction to Western colonization in Egypt, actually. Salafism was born in Egypt and in the Middle East, and actually that was an intent to build an ideology that would be able to compete with the Western ideology and to promote a modern Islam. So in Central Asia, a few Tatars were promoters of this reform of Islam, this modernization of Islam. You have a picture of Musa Jahalabidi, who was a Tatar from the Volga region. And those intellectuals and those Arabic influence I've quoted before, Jalaluddin al-Afghani, who was coming from Iran, actually, Mohammed Abdu, who was Egyptian, then after Rashid Rida, who was also Egyptian, Rashid Rida, I think he was coming, from Syria, have influenced clerics, modern clerics among the Uyghurs. And among the Uyghurs, the very first clerics to promote this reform Islam was Abdul Qadir Damollah, who was living from Kashgar. He was killed by the Chinese governor of the region in 1924. And then this thinking, more reformist thinking, slowly developed in Xinjiang, but was marginal. Islam was dominated by Sufi Islam, let's say, until the Cultural Revolution, when religion was forbidden. And then during the 80s, during the period of reform in China, you heard about that time, Chinese state has opened new space of freedom, cultural freedom, religious freedom, and there has been a huge development of Islamic practice and Islamic teaching in Xinjiang in the 80s. And during that time, those Muslim reformists started diffusing in Xinjiang this new modern version of Islam. So you see on this slide the figures about the number of mosques in Kashgar prefecture in the western part of Xinjiang. You can see at the end of Cultural Revolution there were nearly no mosques. And you see after 15 years, the number of mosques have nearly reached the number of mosques before the arrival of the Chinese Communist Party in the area. There have been also an expansion of the Quranic teaching, and also those Muslim scholars, you know, defending this reformist way of interpreting Islam, were at the core of the development of some of the schools, and especially in southern Xinjiang. And so, during the 80s, the way the Uyghurs were practicing or seeing Islam starting evolving. So a few Uyghurs were ready to get in touch with Salafism, which has developed during that time in the rest of the Muslim world. Because until that time, they were Sufi practitioners. So they were following Sufi Islam, which is totally incompatible with Salafism. So for Salafi, Sufi Muslims are kafirun, are non-Muslims. They reject totally their interpretation of Islam. So during the 80s, there have been a development of politicized Islam in Xinjiang, and those people who wanted to reform Islam started defending the idea of Islamizing, you know, the rules of life, of the rules around the social life. But also some of them were thinking about independence and the setting up of a Muslim state. I've taken an extract of a report of the team of Chinese scholars from the Xinjiang Shurui in Urumqi, and they were saying in some places in southern Xinjiang, a small number of ethnic separatists cloaked in religion are spreading separatism and fighting for ideological strongholds, grabbing grassroots political power, etc., etc. So the Chinese authority discovered that in those networks of madrasas and mosques, there was the rise of political Islam, an Islam that was promoting independence and the setting up of an Islamic state, actually. So from the late 80s and during the 90s, Chinese authorities have started controlling the teaching and the practicing of Islam. And the problem is those very politicized students in religion started thinking that they were no more for dialogue with the Chinese space. Because at the same time, you know, we are after 1989, after the Tiananmen movement, and after the Tiananmen movement, you know, the Chinese Communist Party fall under the control of the conservative wing of the party, because the reformists, they were quite open in the 80s quite open on the idea of evolving the way the Chinese state should govern the autonomous area. But for the conservatives, there's no dialogue possible. So the minorities, they have to follow the path the Chinese Communist Party has decided. And the Communist Party had decided in Xinjiang to forbid any political thinking that was not respected, the model of nation promoted by the Chinese Communist Party. So at that time, those young students started gathering and forming underground networks. So that was the beginning of the political structuration of those Islamist students under the networks of the East Turkestan Islamic Party. In Uyghur, Sharqi Turkestan Islami Partisi. And those young students have tried to launch a jihad in the region of Kashgar in April 1990, who was quickly crushed down by the Chinese authority. But at that time, they have realized the idea was to launch the same kind of jihad as in Afghanistan, because they had a model of the Afghan people who had been able to win over the Soviet state. So they were thinking, so why not the Uyghurs? We could do the same with the Chinese. But they have realized that the Uyghur society will not follow them, and the imbalance of forces was too high. So after the repression of those movements, some of the elements of those networks started developing a strategy, kind of Palestinized strategy, the same strategy that the Palestinians were following in Iraq. So it was an asymmetric, conflict between a very strong central state, and the aim was to develop guerrilla or terrorism in a way to destabilize the Chinese state and also to get the attention of the Western media and the attention also of the public opinion of Muslim countries to try to get support. It was a very naive way, actually, in seeing politics. But they were quickly crushed down by the state, so there have been a burst of terrorism in the early 90s in Xinjiang, and then the Chinese security system has developed its control over the society, and most of those small cells were smashed down during the 90s. So a small group developed another strategy, and I will end up on that. This small group is known in Western countries as ETIM, East Turkestan Islamic Movement, but actually that was not their real name. ETIM was a name given by Western journalists, but actually the real name was East Turkestan Islamic Party. It's not because they were belonging to the same networks of the first Islamic East Turkestan Islamic Party that was founded in the late 80s and that had launched jihad in Bahrain. There were those people belonging to the same circle. Most of them are studied in Kargilik schools. And those people have decided to delocalize their bases in order to avoid the Chinese repression. So at that time, you know, we are in the year 97, 98. It's the time when Al-Qaeda restructured itself with the local jihadist movement in Pakistan and Afghanistan. You know, Al-Qaeda was a structure that was built at the origin to send, you know, Arabic fighters to fight with the Mujahideen in Afghanistan against the Soviet. And during the 90s, with Osama bin Laden, the movement started expanding, you know, and has launched a jihad against Western countries, Israel, and etc., and etc. And so at that time, they understood that they could develop the connection with those movements, even if at that time they were just thinking about jihad in Xinjiang. They were not thinking about fighting in Iraq or fighting in Palestine against the Western countries or against Israel. But slowly, they get integrated in this jihadist nebula. And the leader of this movement was Hassan Marzoum, who was the leader of ETIM until his death in 2003. This movement has developed links with the Taliban too, was under the protection of the Taliban, a network called the Akrani network. And after 2001, when the NATO, you know, has launched his intervention against the Taliban, this movement has has split it in a way. Some of them have decided to give up the fight because they didn't want to follow Al-Qaeda ideological line, and others, like Hassan Marzoum, have decided to go on with Al-Qaeda, and they went to Pakistan, in Waziristan, in northwestern Pakistan, where they started getting more and more closely integrated with Al-Qaeda. But there have been internal feuds inside those small cells, and actually the movement has disappeared from media's and the attention of specialists, and reappeared at the eve of Beijing Olympic Games in 2008 with a new name, who was Turkestan Islami Partisi, that means Turkestan Islamic Party, and the new generation of fighters, they were closely integrated to Al-Qaeda apparatus. You have here a picture of Abdullah Tamola, which is the current leader of the movement, but also of Abdul Shukur, who was also a leader of movement between 2010 and 2012. And those people, you know, appeared in the Shura Majlis of Al-Qaeda. The Shura Majlis of Al-Qaeda is a kind of, I would say, internal government of Al-Qaeda. I mean, the council who is taking this decision inside Al-Qaeda. And the ideological profile, those militants evolved. Those people, okay, go on advocating jihad in Xinjiang for freeing Xinjiang from Chinese rule, but at the same time, they were totally aligned, totally following the ideological rules of Al-Qaeda, that is to say, to promote jihad all over the world. So, for example, they have conducted attacks against the American embassy in Kyrgyzstan, or they're starting attacking also foreign interests or fighting against foreign governments, for example, fighting against the Afghan pro-Western government now in Afghanistan. But the Syrian crisis has provided a huge help to this network, actually. It allowed to the Turkish Islamic Party to get new supports and to raise massive funds. So I will end up on the impact of the Syrian war on the expansion of the Turkish Islamic Party. Until, let's say, the year 2000, maybe, I don't know, I don't have exact figure, but there were maybe a few dozens of militants inside the networks. And after with the war of Syria, actually, this movement has set up a katiba, I mean, a battalion in Syria, which is called the Turkistan Katibat, and fighting with other Al-Qaeda movements has allowed him to get the attention of the Arabic countries' opinion, mainly the Gulf countries' opinion, but also of the Turkish government, who was trying to find allies in Syria to defend his position and to fight also the Kurds, the YPG Kurds, who are the main threat according to the Turkish government. So in a way, they have benefited from the support of all those movements and people who were sympathetic to Al-Qaeda in the Arabic world, but also of the quite benevolence of the Turkish government, who were thinking, oh, yeah, those Uyghurs fighting with Al-Qaeda can be useful for us to fight Assad regime or to fight the Kurds. So they have been able to recruit through Turkey, actually, hundreds of Uyghurs who wanted to escape China. So there have been several ways to escape China with recruiters either in Central Asia, but mainly in Southeast Asia, because now most of the Uyghurs who escaped China, they escaped through Southeast Asia. And they were dispatched to Turkey, and then from Turkey, they were redispatched to Syria. Because in Turkey also, we have a kind of political wing of this Islamist Uyghur scene, very active in Istanbul, and they are quite close to the conservative circles in Turkey, and they have a network of supporters close to the Turkish government in a way. So actually this movement has expanded drastically. For example, they are mainly present now in the Idlib region, you see in northwestern Syria. And in the Idlib region, they are one of the most powerful foreign jihadist movement. For example, they are foreigners who are fighting under the commanding of those of this Turkish and Islamic Party. For example, there are French people who are fighting with them. That's funny, French fighting under the leadership of Uyghurs inside Al-Qaeda in northern Syria. And so it's very difficult to have precise number about those fighters, but figures go to a few hundreds to a few thousand of Uyghurs now in this region. So it's very easy to understand, because for those people, you know, it's a kind of sanctuary, you know. In Syria, they have no chance to be extradited to China, because when you leave illegally China for whatever reason, Uyghurs, they are scared not to be able to get legal documents to be safe in the country. So going to Afghanistan, going to Syria is a way for those people who also believe in Islam, who want to study Islam because they have the feeling that they don't study the right Islam in China, to have an access to this Islamic education. And through that, they can be channeled to Syria, and they tell them, okay, now you have to fight also for Islam and to help your Sunni Muslim brothers. And actually, you can see in this area of Idlib, this Turkish and Islamic Party has been fighting in lots of important battles, and they have started being quite respected among the fighters fighting for Al-Qaeda in the region. So they have developed a vast network of alliances with lots of movement. I won't quote all of them, with Arabic movement fighting inside Al-Qaeda, but also lots of movement coming from the ex-Soviet Union, and especially the Uzbek movements, because the Uyghurs and the Uzbek, you know, they share very close language. It's a bit like Spanish and Portuguese, you know, it's very close. And a few of them also have joined ISIS, you know, the Islamic State, which is the main competitor for Al-Qaeda in the region. But the problem with ISIS, at the beginning, they have started promoting, you know, documents in Uyghur to attract Uyghurs. But there's a big difference between Al-Qaeda and ISIS. Because inside Al-Qaeda, the Uyghurs are the top of the leadership. So the Uyghurs fighting for those movements, they feel they are protected and respected. The problem with ISIS, the top of the movement is led by the Iraqi and the Syrians. And they were using the Uyghurs as cannon fodder. They were sent to suicide mission and etc. So there have been lots of deserters, people escaping from ISIS and then going to Turkey. And now ISIS is less attractive. Now it's losing ground also in Syria. So most of the Uyghurs involved in jihadist movement are involved in Al-Qaeda. So I will stop here, and thank you for listening to me, and don't hesitate to raise your hands to ask questions.
Gracias por tu presentación tan interesante. Y a partir de aquí, de ahora, de este momento, iniciamos un, espero que intenso debate con vuestras dudas, vuestras inquietudes, vuestras preguntas, vuestras sugerencias, nuestras inquietudes, nuestras sugerencias, nuestras preguntas. ¿Vale?
Okay. This question might show my ignorance of Eastern history and might be a bit off topic, but why did the Turks immigrate so far into the eastern side of the world? Because I mean, that's an immigration of maybe thousands of kilometers, and I don't get why.
Well, it was because of internal feuds among Turkic tribes. There have been also feuds with China, because the Turk, at the moment of their history, they were divided between the Western Turk, who were opponents to Chinese empires, and the Eastern Turks, who were allies to the Chinese empire. So those internal feuds, those permanent feuds, fightings inside the Turkic tribes, led the losers to go west. And slowly the losers were rejected more and more western part of Central Asia. And then after they have seen opportunities, those Turks, they have discovered that the centers of Arabic empires were becoming weaker, and they, like the Ottomans, for example, or the Seljuk Turks, they went to conquer the Arabic empires or to fight against the Byzantine Empire. They have seen also opportunities. So it has made them moving slowly, century after century, to the west and mixing with local people during that time. Yeah.
Forget my English isn't very good, but okay. I want to know what is the general thought of people of mainland China, like Han people or maybe other people, about what's happened right now in Xinjiang. Do they know about what happened there? Like one day I asked a Chinese friend, you know Xinjiang people, and he told me like, no, they are not Chinese. So, okay, I will not make an opinion about I asked one person, but I want to know if they know something about what happened there right now.
I think there is very strong, let's say, mutual discrimination in a sense that you can say that many Han Chinese have very strong prejudice against the Uyghurs, and likewise, vice versa, in a way. So for example, in one way to think about the social communal relations in Xinjiang is more of like a mutual segregation of two communities, have little contact with each other. And so you have, let's say, people will boycott each other's restaurants, and you have little social interaction among each other, and even residential areas are also self-segregated among themselves. So I would not be surprised, for example, that many Han Chinese have a strong prejudice against Uyghurs, and it was still, you know, I mean, often certain criminal activities are often associated with Uyghurs. And similarly, the Uyghurs will also consider that they will never be able to interact and socialize with Han Chinese. And in Xinjiang, for example, you have very strong, let's say, in terms of, let's say, hierarchy, among Uyghurs, obviously, is the hierarchy of like marital, let's say, opportunities. Right? So for example, they will never be able to marry a Han Chinese. And they will also, like they say, you know, certain groups are preferable than other ones. And often that's usually is ranked according to religiosity. So for example, other Turkic groups, Kazakh is also not preferred because Kazakh is not as religious. And then the other ones, perhaps, you know, Uzbek might be considered more religious and more closely aligned with the Uyghurs and more preferred in that way. And on the other hand, even the Chinese, like Hui, which is also Muslim, but also they were often considered as on the side of the Han Chinese. And so there's also often the tension between the Uyghur and the Hui also very strong. So you think of this kind of, one thing I think it's necessary to understand the social relations in Xinjiang is that it's not actually, let's say, a dichotomous kind of relation. It's not a one against one. It's actually sometimes it's multiple groups. They all have different prejudice against each other, and the Chinese state have using, you can say, like divide and conquer or divide and rule kind of strategies. So in many situations, the Chinese state will promote a Kazakh instead of a Uyghur. So in many local governments, ethnic Kazakhs can be more preferred in terms of promotion. And so that is the kind of like, you know, the relations between Uyghurs and the Kazakhs and Hui and other groups are not necessarily good. So that's why it's very complicated in terms of the intergroup relations, not simply between Uyghur and Han, but actually among many groups, it's very complicated.
I understand. So everything is because religion, right?
Yeah, religion is very strong. So that's, you know, Rémi is talking about it a little bit in a way that the Uyghur nationalism for the past decades has transformed from a secular, sort of Marxist secular kind of version of nationalism to a more religious one. And increasingly, to be a good Uyghur is often associated now with religiosity. And this can be you can tell this from, how should I say, the increasing, let's say, influence of Wahhabism in Xinjiang itself, right? In terms of people's dress, you know, like previously, for example, women would wear very colorful hairdresses, but these days are black, right? I mean, those kind of like, burqa, which is very much a recent phenomenon from Afghanistan, Pakistan, right? Basically, full veil of everything. You will not see them in 1980s or 1990s, but nowadays that's become the common thing, right? So obviously there is this kind of trend for more conservative interpretation of what Islam is versus traditional Uyghur sort of more liberal kind of interpretation of Central Asian version of Islam.
So now, because like repression and those things now, maybe Uyghurs have another more radical interpretation about Islam.
Right. Yeah, but it's complicated in terms of like, obviously one is, let's say, a reaction to the repression, right? The other thing is more sort of the spread of Wahhabism is a global phenomenon. It's not just simply in Xinjiang. It represents like Saudi Arabia's general push for the versions of fundamental Islam throughout the world, right? So you think about like in other Asian countries, like for example, like Indonesia, same thing. The style of dress is changing. Like people are increasingly become more like wearing black instead of traditionally might be white, might be different kind of colors dress. So that is a global phenomenon, not simply in Central Asia. It's a global recent phenomenon of growing influence of Wahhabism. Yeah.
Right now in mainland China, there is kind of propaganda against like Muslim people.
Yes.
Yes.
Right. So recently, for example, you have lots of tactics by the government try to to compel people not to practice Islam, right? So one is more of for example, like banning of veil and scarves in public places for people who are public employees and they're not usually they're forbidden, for example, wearing certain things, right? So this is actually in some ways equivalent to French banning of the veil. It's sort of similar, right, in a way. But what's more vicious was more of saying that, for example, they will compel people not to comply with Ramadan. So like if you're a government employee, then basically you're not supposed to fast, right? And then usually the students are forbidden to let's say, go to mosques. So basically, religion is only reserved for people who are over the age of 18, for example. So that is a strict ban. And also, like recently, I think certain policies were saying that men should shave off the beard. Right? I mean, there are certain things that are associated with Islam, like beard, like scarf and veil. Those kind of things are basically being target of state sort of like repression.
Right
Yeah.
now, I think all over the world, in Europe too, we're talking about these days about burqa and those things, and are very
Right. So yes, that's the sort of. I mean, obviously, it's not the same thing, right? But increasingly, that the Chinese state has become more aggressive in terms of its target of some religious symbols in Xinjiang. Yes.
I'd like to know what are the main arguments for and against independence of Xinjiang, Tibet, and Inner Mongolia. Specifically against, since I'm interested in the official version, I guess, of the Chinese government, and also what is your perspective, your opinion in the matter, maybe?
So I think there is actually quite a different thing between, if you look at Xinjiang and Tibet. Tibet is much more clear in the sense that it's more demographically not like homogeneous, and then is also relatively clear in terms of its territorial boundary and its national boundary, right? So you can think about like historical Tibet and its claim is very much sort of overall coincide with what is sort of current people like reside in a sense, right? So obviously the problem when it gets to Tibet is usually how to deal with those areas that Tibetans live outside Tibet itself. So basically they'll be in Sichuan, in Qinghai, or in Gansu, whatnot. But those are basically outside Tibet itself. But still, overall Tibetan areas are more homogeneous. But that's not the case in Xinjiang. Even historically, Uyghurs do not really have the whole area that what they call Xinjiang today. So there is one of the maps, for example, Rami showed you earlier, in a way that northern Xinjiang historically were more Kazakh or Mongol or different kind of nomadic groups rather than the Uyghur itself. So that basically, there's one thing in a way that sometimes the area that claimed by people are not necessarily correspond with the sort of actual places they reside, right? And the other one is feasibility. Feasibility resides to, so what if you have independence? What do you do with 40% of Han Chinese living there, right? And obviously, you know, there are different ways to think through the consequences of things like that, right? And they're not really, I mean, you can go from more sort of inclusive, kind of happy ending situation to a very violent situation that you have basically two group people want to kill each other, right? As a mutual self-defense of each other. So this kind of, if you think about in the literature of political science, often people talk about polarization. So ethnic tensions are the most violent or most dangerous. It's not necessarily in situations where you have lots of ethnic groups. If groups are fragmented, it doesn't actually mean it's going to be more volatile or more violent. Society is more violent when two groups are of relatively equal in size. And that's when you get into a very dangerous situation, because either one of them have the chance of defeating the other one, and then they can easily go for a full, front attack of each other. And often Xinjiang is like that. And so that's, if you think about the future of any sort of mass scale violence, I'll pick Xinjiang. That's most fertile for such violence. Is you have two groups of people who have very strong prejudice and hatred against each other, and they're equally in size. And so if the central state collapse, I'll predict civil war and ethnic cleansing in Xinjiang. That'd be my prediction. It's like Syria in a way. You have two sort of strong held hatred against one group against another one, and it's most likely to happen. Tibet is actually less likely in a way because first of all, the reason why settlement of Han Chinese in Tibet has been not successful, that's because Tibet is too high in terms of altitude. So it's often very hard for people who are from low valley plain areas to live for a very long period in Tibet, because it's difficult to adjust. So that's the reason why most of the migrants to Tibet often are short-term ones. People don't stay for very long. They go for a few years and come back because they cannot take it anymore. So it's more like that. So in a way that let's say the territorial sort of the nation sort of national boundary is much clearer in Tibetan case. Yeah. So that'd be my prediction.
So what do you think would be the best course of action?
Well, the best course of action, or there are different ways of thinking about what exactly do you want, or what position do you come from, right? So let's say if you are Uyghur nationalist, obviously you want a purity. You basically want to kick out anyone who's not Uyghur, and then you want to have your own thing, right?
Well, what I mean is with the objective of ending racial tension.
Right. Well, there are different ways to think through. One is partition, right? So basically, in some ways, you cannot have it all. You probably have to separate them. So one is basically carve up half, and then that's one way, right? But then again, I think it will be very difficult for many nationalists to accept that outcome, even though that probably is more likely to be peaceful, perhaps. And the other one is basically to have more inclusive society. But how likely that to happen, I don't know, right? I mean, you can think about, let's say, more democratic versions of, let's say, proportionality in terms of its let's say the compartmentalization in terms of West. Think about some of European models, such as in Belgium. You have the Flemish parts and the Walloon parts, but sort of relatively equal in terms of the ability to check on each other, right? But then separate, right? So similar models might be sort of available, perhaps, in a more democratic version, but I don't think that's likely. My prediction is going to be very bloody.
Yo tengo tres cuestiones. Me autopido la palabra. Vale. So, in my case. So, questions, comments, suggestions, I don't know really. What else? The first one is for all of us, especially for Rémi, because you have been describing the riots, the protests, no? So one question is, I was thinking about many years ago in Yale University with Jen Scott about the weapons of the weak, no? So, the weapons of the weak, any different kind of resistance really, because we are really focusing in some special kind of conflict, resistance, fighting, but means about thinking another kind of conflict, or so, well, maybe with historical perspective really, so the ideological, religion conflicts, the religion resistance really for imposition of the Chinese state or another empire. So it's not really a question, it's about reflection about this one. So the other is about both us are describing really a colonial approach, no? So a colonial appropriation of the territory, of the minds, of the bodies, of the religions. So thinking in our case, really, now in a Stan case, really about the colonial approach. So really, for example, what you're talking about Islamic modernization, no? So another kind of modernization from Islamic. Really, it's not a program, a political approach for a new decolonial resistance, a new decolonial refuse for the Chinese state. So it's because really you are describing an extractivist historical process, and especially now in this moment, no, from extractivists of oil, grain, gentrification of the territory, majority of harm in urban areas, minorities in rural areas. So means that this means that the extractivity of the territory, because we are marginalization in some of the miners. And the last one, I was thinking about identities, especially, no? And I was remember a very known book, Oasis Identities, by Rudelson. So very know about Xinjiang, no? and this area. And in my case, in our case, working, researching about Oasis identities in another part of the world, in America, for example, I was thinking about identities in Oasis area. What kind of characteristics we can describe? So isolation, austerity. So what kind of identities we can identify with Oasis? No, thinking about a comparative approach with another area. So this is not really a question, it's a suggestion and discussion, really.
Yeah, about Oasis identities, actually, what is very interesting with Uyghurs, it's a very good case to understand the way nationalist identity emerged. Because the Uyghurs actually didn't have any ethnonym until the 20s. Actually, there were no national label for the Uyghurs. The Uyghurs, they had local identities based on oases. For example, the people from Kashgar, who I think they were Kashgari, Kashgarlik, the Turpan in the East Turpanlik, and etc. And they had dialects slightly different, because we Westerners, we live in modern scientific states. That's an expression used by Anthony Smith to explain the way the state, through the control of your representation, builds its legitimacy. You know, when you were born, nobody asked you if you wanted to be Spanish, French, or Chinese. You are, in a way, forced to be French, Spanish, or Chinese because you learn a nationalist interpretation of your history. That's my case, for example. I belong to an oppressed minority in France. I'm Gascon, actually. Actually, we had the language totally different from the French, and etc. But the change of the French state was that local nationalism in France emerged very lately. And we were first socialized inside the public French school who learned them that we were French. And then people have forgiven their language and did not develop any identity because they didn't feel repressed. They were feeling equal to the other French, and so it was not a problem. So actually the Uyghur identity was not structured by nationalism, was not influenced by nationalism until the 20th century, when this Jadid ideology diffused in Xinjiang. So in those schools, school is the core of everything. You know, if you want to build a state, you have to build a legitimacy. You have to make people accept your authority. Max Weber was saying state is an institution that detains the monopoly of legitimate violence. If you want your violence to be legitimate, you have to propose a discourse that will allow you to get the support of the population. And you get this discourse through the reconstruction of history. So the Uyghurs, actually, the Chinese have reconstructed history, but the Uyghurs also, they have reconstructed their own history. And there were a debate in the 20s, for example, in the Soviet Union, because the Soviets, they were the ones who have developed this Uyghur national identity. But in Tashkent, during the Congress in the early 20s, there were people saying, no, the Uyghurs, they don't exist. There are two nationalities among the Uyghurs. They are the Kashgarlik, the people, the Kashgari. So mainly all the Uyghurs from the south. And they are the Khuljaluk, the Uyghurs from the north, in northern Xinjiang, because they are a bit influenced by Mongolian, Kazakh culture, Russian culture, and etc. And so there have been huge infights to define what was the Uyghur nation. Were they Uyghurs or were they Kashgarlik and Khuljaluk? And then that's the Uyghur option that won. And now all the Uyghurs, they all believe they are Uyghurs and they belong to the same nation. But as you said, each oasis had its identities, and sometimes, for example, between Khulja, Turpan, and Kashgar, the dialects, okay, you could understand each other's, but it was a bit like Spanish and Portuguese, actually. You have some kind of difference. Now, there's a modern standardized Uyghurs, and those dialects have mostly disappeared. So, but yeah, the locality and, for example, the people from the Tarim Basin, they had, through the exchanges, through the Silk Road, quite common cultural rasgos in Espanol, because, for example, the influence of Islam was stronger, for example, in the Tarim Basin than in Turfan, in Khami, in the eastern part, where they were more closely in contact with the Chinese, and they were converted to Islam later in the eastern part of Xinjiang. Because one must know that the Uyghurs, before being Muslim, they were Buddhist, actually. Those civilizations were belonging to Buddhism. So yeah, you had very strong local identities that were actually deleted by the rise of the nationalist reconstruction of history, either by the Uyghur nationalism and the Chinese state.
I'm a student from France, and I'm studying the minorities, but in the medieval period. And I'm really interested in knowing the evolution, because these identities are very old. The Hui and the Huip, for example, they came in the 9th or the 10th century, so it's very old, and I thought that it was part of the Chinese society, that I'm really curious to know why so far there are still conflicts between these identities, like the Han and Hui and Uyghurs. And also because, for example, based on what I read, there are some very known Hui as Zhang He, that was a traveler, and based on what I read, the Chinese are very proud of him. So this is why I'm a bit confused now about the relations.
Yeah. Okay. I get what you're saying. Actually, I would say relation between the Hui and Han Chinese are not necessarily that bad. Yeah. And also the Hui identities with the Han Chinese is also localized because Hui is a group spread across whole country. It's not simply concentrated in a particular area or not, right? So you have Hui communities in Beijing, you have Hui communities in Xi'an, we have Hui communities in Yunnan, you have many Hui communities throughout the country. Now, you do have occasional, let's say, intercommunal clashes, like often, for example, with regarding the halal sort of food kind of industry. So you have some incidents like that. For example, like sometimes, you know, in the local news report that basically, well, the halal factory actually was not really proper, and then you have like some kind of protest. But overall, currently speaking, for example, relation between the Hui and Han Chinese is not necessarily confrontational, or it's not necessarily good, but not necessarily bad either. Now, historically, there are occasions where Hui were targeted. Like during the Qing period, for example, you have very strong, let's say, pogroms against the Hui, like, you know, in Xi'an, for example, you have, you know, periods of time that the Hui were targeted for political repression, right? And then similarly, you have Hui rebellions throughout Chinese history. Right, so the Pan-Day rebellion in Yunnan in around mid-19th century was also, basically a Muslim rebellion against the Chinese state. But contemporary speaking, the relation between Han and Hui are okay. I'll just put it okay. Now, the Hui's relation between Hui and the Uyghur is more complicated, and I don't think they get along. Now, that's mostly because of the Uyghurs' suspicion the Hui essentially are Chinese. So that's why they speak Chinese, look Chinese, in a sense that they don't look Central Asian now. And also, interesting phenomenon is that in much of the Western China, the groups that come directly in contact with the Tibetans or with Uyghurs are not Han Chinese necessarily. They are Hui themselves. So in Gansu or in Qinghai, in many places, local conflict are also between Tibetans and Hui, not with Han, because Han live in the cities, you don't really see them necessarily. So it's all the like rural communities, you have the Hui against Tibetans. Similarly, in parts of Xinjiang as well, many of the Han Chinese, for example, living in cities or in very isolated, let's say, military sort of, you know, construction corp kind of places, right? So often many of the day-to-day contact or encountering were basically between the Uyghur and the Hui, and often those relations were not necessarily that good. Yeah. So it's not simply like a dichotomy. That's what I'm trying to emphasize. It's multiple ways of encountering with each other. Yeah.
Maybe if I just can add something to what you said, actually. The concept of nation is really recent in history, and for example, during the 19th century, the systems of mobilization were not relying, political mobilization were not relying on nation because there were no national identity among those minorities in China. But for example, were relying on religious networks, for example. For example, many times in Xinjiang, you know, which is where you have an Islam deeply influenced by Sufism, you could find the Hui, what we call now the Hui, and that means the Chinese-speaking Muslim. But for example, at that time, the Hui means all the Muslims in China. But now the Hui only means the Chinese-speaking Muslim. But for example, they were belonging to the same Sufi lodge. And actually, what was the main political mobilization tools were the line your lodge master was defending. For example, the Naqshbandiya was a very powerful lodge in Xinjiang, and you could find Uyghurs and Hui fighting together the Qing government. Well, okay, sometimes they fight each other's, but when they wanted to defend Islam and to reject the rule of an emperor who was not a Muslim emperor, they were fighting together. And actually they've started really having strong, we say defiance, strong lack of confidence with the rise of nationalism among the Hui and among the Uyghurs. And now from now on, they are very suspicious of each other. But, for example, inside the Hui also you have local fightings between sects, religious sects. Sects. You have the Sufis, who are very strong in northwestern China, but the Sufis are divided among different sects: the Qadiriya, the Naqshbandiya, the Khufiya, etc., etc. And between also different interpretation of Islam, between the Sufi, between the Qadim school or the Salafi, or the Ikhwani, or the Salafiyye, now is a more recent movement, or the Sidaotang, etc. So actually, they were not an homogeneous group. Those way, the same as the Uyghurs, who were divided among their Oasis identities, and sometimes Oasis has fighted each other among the Uyghurs. So we have to see those issues not with the eyes of people living in modern nation states, but with the eyes of people living in pre-modern society, actually.
Si no tenemos preguntas ni más cuestiones después de algunas horas de trabajo, y emplazamos a todos al próximo viernes en esta misma sala, Jane Billward, Universidad de Georgetown. Continuamos. Gracias a todas y a todos.